Hi, AP European History. This is going to be my second or third attempt to record this and get this information out to you. So hopefully this one will be faster and hopefully the volume's working. Before we get to the end of the European state and the Renaissance, I did want to just mention very quick some of the big writers of the Renaissance. Obviously, we read parts of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and we saw that that was mainly written in the vernacular and it was for entertainment purposes. More's Utopia, Sir Thomas More, The Perfect World, we discussed that. And then also of note, Shakespeare. We'll be talking about him a little bit more in another unit. So I did want to bring up Don Quixote. Don Quixote is written during the late Renaissance, during the 1500s, and it's considered one of the classic pieces of Spanish literature. I know you guys are reading that right now. It's assigned for next week. But here again, you know, the so what of Don Quixote was a reflection of the passing of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and Reformation, and Quixote was kind of the embodiment of the old ideal of medieval chivalry and knights. So you'll get plenty of Don Quixote. But I'm going to go ahead back and try to knock this out pretty quickly. Okay, so here we go. Give it a try. Okay, the 100 Years' War, we talked a lot about the 100 Years' War in the first unit. The end result of it it really provided a national identity for France because there was a whole idea of us versus them, the French versus the English. The French monarchy was strengthened as a result of the 100 Years' War with their eventual win over the English monarchy. And for the English monarchy, it did weaken the king, but it didn't weaken nobles. So that was one of those multiple choice questions from the quiz last week. In France, Charles VII was going to strengthen the French government. He was going to pass an annual tax called the tally, which strengthened the monarchy. It established the royal army and the whole idea of a professionally trained, large-standing military that served the nation-state of France. So this is pushing us into the modern era. The Pragmatic Sanction, essentially, this was passed so that the Estates General was weakened under Charles VII. So basically, more power to the monarch, more power to the king, less power to any kind of representative government in France at this time period. He would strengthen it further for Louis XI, who is going to follow. He was called the Spider King because of his wild and wily ways. Quote-unquote Spielvogel. But one of the things Louis XI does is he does enlarge France's borders because Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, actually controlled what was known as the Middle Kingdom between France and Germany, and I'll show you that right here. Okay, what will later become known as the Alsace-Lorraine. And Louis XI, after Charles the Bold dies in battle, is killed in battle with the Swiss, of all people, the new, Swiss. After Charles the Bold's killed in battle, Louis XI takes the Low Countries into France as part of France, and that's going to be a whole area of dissension between Germany and France for the next 300-ish years, okay? So that's kind of an important part, strengthening of the French kingdom and the enlarging of the French Empire. So when you see a map of the Renaissance, basically you just have to understand what you're looking at. This is a map of Europe during the Renaissance. Why? Because it has the HRE, was it a thing, right? And it has all the independent city-states in Italy. So I look at that map, I see the HRE, I see the independent city-states in Italy, I see the coming up of the Habsburgs, I see France, I see England, I see Spain being unified here between Castile and Aragon, and I think that's the late Middle Ages, the early Renaissance. That's the map of Europe. Okay, next, big so what? So after the 100 Years' War ended, there was a lot of dissension over who was going to have the power in England. So England descends into its own civil war. This is called the War of the Roses. I could talk a ton about this, but I'm not going to because it was one of my favorite wars of this time period. It was between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and Shakespeare wrote all kinds of material about this, two houses divided, and they were actually brought together by a marriage, so very much kind of a Romeo and Juliet sort of situation between the House of York and House of Lancaster. There used to be a all-star football game between York and Lancaster County called the War of the Roses. Unfortunately, they did away with that 6 years ago, but that was a really cool idea because the battle continued. What happened with the War of the Roses? This was The House of York, the Yorkist king, the last Yorkist king was Richard III. Richard III, very controversial. His remains were just unearthed a couple years ago. The Hunchback King supposedly killed his 2 young nephews who were supposed to be heirs to the throne. They just kind of disappeared. But it was all for naught because Richard III, in an age where monarchs led their troops out to battle, remember what just happened to Charles the Bold, okay? Richard III is going to lead his troops out to battle versus Henry VII, and Richard III is actually going to be killed on the battlefield and cut to pieces. So here comes the House of the Tudors. Here comes the Tudor dynasty, and they're going to be huge. We're going to talk about them a lot. They abolished livery and maintenance, and the to-do for that was nobles could not maintain private armies any longer. So Henry VII said, listen, I'm the king. The army belongs to me. You guys don't have your own private armies, but you can maintain soldiers as long as they are beholden to me. That was livery and maintenance. He established the Court of the Star Chamber, which is essentially the Inquisition for the court. They would basically take in anybody who was going against the king, going against Henry VII, and they would use torture and anything necessary in order to get a confession. And of course, there was no trial, no jury. It was just the king. Okay. Income and commerce. Henry VII was good at getting taxes. And I think I'm going to pause one sec.